Welcome to A Canadian Investing in the U.S., a podcast and YouTube channel focused on Canadians buying real estate with host Glenn Sutherland.
Welcome to another episode of A Canadian Investing in the U.S. This week, my guest is Scott Krone. Scott, if you could give us an introduction to yourself, please.
Oh, first of all, thank you very much for having me, Glenn.
Oh, no problem.
But I appreciate it. I grew up in the Chicagoland area and got to know the Toronto area very well because of my son playing hockey up there. Yeah. So we spent a lot of time going back and forth, and there's a lot of similarities between the two cities. But I grew up in the Chicagoland area and then began pursuing a master's degree in architecture once I graduated from college. And that's when I got into real estate. And so I was doing multifamily developments for the company that I was working for. And then I started my own company in 1998. And we began with single family houses, new construction. And then we progressed into multifamily mixed use apartments, commercial flex space, warehouse. And then after the big crash in 08, 09, we got more into self-storage and sold off all of our other assets and have been focusing on self-storage.
Excellent. You kind of did a transition there going through the different levels. What's the reason between each one? Is it like growing steps, or like why would you go from the single family to the multifamily and then to the self-storage? Is that do you think that's a natural progression, or is there a reason?
Well, when I was doing the multifamily, I was working for a top 20 builder in the United States. And I mean, the first project I did was my master's thesis, and it was $100 million. Wow. And so, I worked there for 6 years and they were still going on after I left, but I was also in charge of a 40 unit, $25 million project and a 57 unit, $17 million project. So, these were very large scale type stuff. So when I started my company, just building something from the ground up, we started with a $300,000 home that we bought the property, tore it down and built one for $350,000 and sold it for $1,050,000. So, that's we just began building and growing from there. So it's hard to jump fully into a large scale multifamily. Yeah. And so, shortly, a couple of years later, we did do our first 12 unit townhome division. And, but our philosophy was always to go where the market takes us rather than trying to dictate the market. So in 08, 09, when everything crashed, the entire market was, forced into apartments, because that was the only thing that people could lend on. In fact, our first self-storage facility was a building that was supposed to have been torn down and converted into townhomes and condominiums. But because all the banks pulled their financing due to the recession, they couldn't do it. And so it left the 90,000 square foot building, which we then converted into self-storage. So for me, it's a lot more predictable. It's a lot more, we can model it. And also it's a fraction of the exposure. So, 400 condominiums and townhomes was $100 million. I can do 500, 600 rental units and lockers for less than 10% of that. I mean, it's just a much different scale. So I have a lot less exposure and it's more predictable.
Yeah, I'm thinking renovating dollars per square foot. You're not doing kitchens. You're not doing, tile floor probably. You're not doing a lot of this stuff. You're just making it so people don't go from one locker to the next one.
Well, even if they do, it's not the end of the world, right? But I'm certainly, I say people can have any color locker they want as long as it's white. And, it's the model, the Henry Ford model. Yeah. It's apartments without toilets. I mean, it's the model. It's just a more simplistic version of it. And as you said, I don't have to worry about if I pick the right tile or the right color cabinets or appliances or any of those sorts of things. It's a lot more simplistic.
Whenever I picture self-storage, I always think of those, big orange buildings that, the sort of warehouse sort of ones that are sitting along the highways. You just talked about doing a conversion. How do you know if you can do a conversion, or if the market could sustain a conversion? How do you, because maybe you have this apartment building, your things aren't going well, or you bought one that's completely vacant. And, I tend to buy really rough buildings and try to renovate them. So maybe you're buying something like that and try to convert it to self-storage. How do you know it makes sense to turn it to self-storage?
Well, there's multiple components to your question, so
I know,
I'll try to
sorry,
break it down.
I kind of ranted there.
No worries. So let's just take, how do we know if a market is good? So it doesn't really matter if we're converting or buying an existing or expanding an existing or building new. It's the same question. So how do we know that a market is good? You know, we can do saturation studies within a specific property. So every site that we consider, we're doing an analysis of that 1, 3, 5 mile radius, or if it's more rural, you know, how long does it take to drive 15 miles? Or 15 minutes, I should say.
Yep.
You know, so obviously to drive 15 minutes in New York City, you go 2 blocks. But, you know, if you're out in the country, you could probably go 60 miles because it's, you know, you're going 60 miles an hour.
Yep.
So we look at what is the radius if it's more rural in terms of drive time versus, you know, radius in terms of mileage. But we're always looking at the saturation level. So the national average in the United States, to keep in mind that 10% of the population uses self-storage in the United States. And where supply equals demand typically is around 7 square feet of lockers per capita. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, and the rules are changing. The pandemic has certainly altered the metrics of that. But like the East Coast, Florida, Texas, California, we're seeing the saturation above 9. You know, it's in Florida, it's almost pushing 11 square feet of lockers per capita. People are going in and developing where it's 9. And, you know, we have gone into markets where it's 2. You know, the highest we've gone into is 4. So we always know that when we go into a market, there is demand. So it's just a matter of providing the supply, and then the demand will fill it up. So that is the same across the board. Then the next thing, if we're looking for, is what are the entitlements? What are the zoning? What is allowable? And that's usually one of the biggest hindrances in terms of moving forward with a project, is if, you know, the municipality is not receptive to a change and allowing self-storage. A lot of municipalities don't like self-storage, but it serves a need. You know, as housing goes more and more expensive, you know, self-storage is a viable option, not just for consumers, but also for businesses. And so, you know, I mean, that's why we were deemed essential by every governmental agency during the pandemic. We did not have one day of closure because of the pandemic, because it's needed. And then, so then the next thing is, does the building, if we're doing a conversion, does the building lend itself to that? So, you know, do we have the ceiling heights? Do we have the load capacity? Do we have access? Do we have the ability to get into the building? How easy is it to get into the building? So we look at all 3 of those things, and before we evaluate, you know, does this building or project make sense?
That's interesting. And like when you're saying like buying above the $7 per of locker per capita, when you're saying that, I was thinking you're going to be talking about like say New York, because maybe you could do more, because I'm thinking like they're living in smaller areas, they need more storage. That's where I thought you were going to, like when you started talking about Florida, I was like, interesting, because when I think of Florida, I always think of houses and more than apartment buildings, right?
Right. So the thing, I mean, if you think about the general housing stock, the things that tend to kill self-storage are garages, basements, and attics, and big front yards. So like if you're out in Texas in the middle of the country, I mean, if you don't need something, you park it in your front or backyard, right? Or, you know, you put up a barn.
Yep.
So when you have the housing stock that does not have basements, garages, or attics, then people don't really have other places to put things. Now, what's happened during the pandemic is that how we use our homes has changed. You know, people would always say to me, why do you tear down homes and build new ones? Well, I say, well, in the last 50 years, we're dramatically using homes differently. Within the last year, we're dramatically using homes differently. We now have more home offices. I've always had one. I began my company out of my home.
Yep.
But a lot of people are now having to have home offices, home educational areas, and also home exercise areas. And so, you know, these 3 things have altered how we use homes. And so if you need that extra room for your, you know, your Peloton or your NordicTrack or whatever it is, then you got to move stuff out. And where do you put it? And you put it into self-storage if you're not willing or can't afford to get a bigger place.
It makes a lot of sense. Whenever I'm like looking at like, you know, multifamily or single family, I'm always like comparing like, you know, landlord and tenant friendly states is one of the things that comes up, right? Does that even come into play at all in self-storage? Like, is there different laws for different states for self-storage? for like, I guess, emptying lockers and stuff that are more beneficial?
No, that's another reason why, one, we stopped buying apartments in Illinois, and specifically the city of Chicago. It's just become so onerous in terms of being tenant friendly. It's almost, penal in terms of if you're the owner of the property. So, I really caution people when they're, like, I want to buy an apartment building in Chicago. Well, the laws are very incredibly strict for that. In fact, like the teachers union, when they were picketing, they were doing their soft picket about, teaching in the COVID, they were trying to mandate that the city of Chicago enforced rent abatement to keep people from having to pay their rent. Now, why does the teachers union trying to dictate to the city of Chicago what, private property owners are able to do or collect or not collect? I mean, that just shows you the power of the politics that were going on behind the teachers union here in Chicago and the pressures that the city was facing. So that's the general atmosphere, or, the laws that we have to deal with here in Chicago. I don't have any of those. Granted, during the pandemic, grace was given. We actually offered economic incentive programs to people during that pandemic period of time, but the collections only went up 1 or 2% during the pandemic. For the most part, everyone that I know that owns self-storage, and the reports that I've heard on a national scale, so I'm a part of a mastermind of operators across the country. Yeah, occupancy was at an all-time high. Everything was filling up. And if I went back and studied the last 4 major recessions, there was a slight downturn and then 2 to 3% increase annually after the downturn. And it's the only asset class that I've seen in real estate in 30 years that actually thrives during a recession. And so, I deemed it recession resistant. A lot of people call it recession proof. Yeah. I don't think there's anything that's proof. Yeah. I think it's more resistant to recessions.
Okay. And then say they aren't paying, like, what is the eviction process? Is it just like on TV where you do the auction at the locker and people come in and they bid and take these granite lockers and they open it up and it's full of gold?
No, the best one I've ever heard was, I have a friend who owns some facilities out in Massachusetts, and he's in more of the rural area. Yeah. And this guy, unbeknownst to him, put a BMW model 2002. So this is, not the year 2002, but the model. So it's a classic car. It's like, 30 years old. Yeah. And the guy stopped paying his rent, and, he called him up, and he finally got hold of the guy. And he's like, "Hey, look, I got a DUI. There's no public transportation out there. I can't get the car. I don't know what to do with the car. So why don't you just keep the car?" Whoa. But, most of the time, it's just paper, it's files, it's things that, sentimental things that people are holding on to. So it's not these gold mines that you see on TV. That's obviously very sensationalized. The first step is just simply overlocking the locker. So they can't come and get their stuff until they make a payment. Okay. And then if they're not doing that after a certain amount of time, then there is a sale, or you basically clean it out and throw the stuff away. We're in the process of buying one right now. And the collections, the operator said, "Hey, you know what? I got it from my dad. We haven't done anything really with it in the last 3 or 4 years. We haven't raised rents, And I looked at the receivables, and some were like almost a year. And they're like, "Yeah, we overlocked it. They'll eventually pay." And so, just by, improving the management, we can improve the operations and the efficiency of that facility, and increase the value of it by a couple $100,000, because of the fact that, if you're raising rents and you're collecting, your NOI is going to increase. And if you just hold the cap rate, you'll be able to, perform the building and make the building more valuable. So, that's an example of someone who just not really caring anymore. And that's a pretty common experience for the smaller facilities, like what you were describing originally. Yeah. The more rural Class C or Class B type facilities. So we're involved in all 3 classes. We're involved in Class C, Class A, and Class B.
Interesting. And you mentioned the cap rate. So I'm guessing that lending, it runs similar to like the multifamily when you're doing the lending for this?
It is similar. The only difference is that we have economic occupancy versus physical occupancy. And so, because we're always offering like first month free or, a discount. And so the economic occupancy will always lag. in multifamily, if you're physically occupied, you should have like your collection should equal your physical, right? You shouldn't have that lag,
Yeah.
right? Unless it's some collections,
Yeah.
but we're always lagging during the lease up period of time.
Okay, that's interesting, because I was kind of curious about that when I was thinking about this beforehand, because I was like, is this more like multifamily, or is this more like mobile home parks where it's going to be difficult to finance it? Are lenders open to this asset class?
Oh yeah, we have everything from an SBA loan to private, local banks to private lending who, have worked with us in terms of, equity, and then CMB financing. Insurance really love it when it gets stabilized. And so they become very aggressive with the financing once the projects are stabilized.
That's interesting. That's good. No, like that's one of the things I was worried. I'm like, this is going to be another thing if I decide to go there that I'm going to have to try and strike up some seller financing.
Yeah, people do it. It is surprising. It is a common, especially with the Class C facilities when people buy them. It is a common thing where people do want some income off of it, but they just don't want to manage the property anymore.
Interesting. For running these things, what kind of expenses, what kind of overhead is there, right? Because I'm guessing, it's not like a multifamily where you can put a lot of the utilities on the tenants. You'd be paying electricity. What other stuff is there involved with running one of these things?
So if we're comparing it to apartments, it's obviously a lot less. We're anywhere from 25 to 35% expense ratio compared to 55 with multifamily.
Yep.
The biggest thing is we don't have the repairs, and our utilities, even in our Class A facilities, when you're not walking through it, the lights shut off. So as soon as you start walking through it, there's a motion sensor, the lights kick on, they're then on a timer, and then if there's no motion, they shut back off. So we're trying to keep our utilities down low.
Yep.
And then obviously in a Class B or C, then the only thing you'll be paying for in a Class B is if you're conditioning the space, providing heating or cooling. But otherwise it's just site lighting. But the biggest thing is, in a Class C or B, we're actually going without personnel on site. We're going remote so that you can hit a keypad and you gain entrance. And then, we can see who's going in and coming out, and then we can video it. And then, in terms of operating it, we just have our landscapers maintain the property and make sure it's clean and presentable, those sorts of things. If we have to overlock it, we ask the landscaper to do that sort of stuff. So we can really reduce expense ratios quite a bit compared to multifamily. The biggest expense is usually property taxes. That, and in our Class A facilities, it's the labor of having we typically have 1.5 people on site. So that's one full-time and one part-time person.
Okay. The only last question that popped in my head is property management. Is it, I'm guessing, do you pay like a percentage, just like multifamily, like a 4% for of rent collected, or how does that work? Or do you just keep it in-house? Do you have your own property management? Because I'm guessing you could keep it in-house pretty easily if you're doing it all with cameras and locks, right?
Yeah, you do need to have the systems if you're going to self-manage it. You can do it, but it depends on where you are in relationship to the asset and what it's like. So the biggest thing is you want to make sure that you have people that can answer the phone, because historically, you would have to drive by a self-storage facility and then pull in. But now people are using the internet to find it, and then they'll call to make the reservation. So the first thing is just really having a full-time phone system that can answer calls, or your website is up to date, that it can take reservations or sales online. So that's very critical to the whole process. There are third-party REITs, which are the real estate investment trusts.
Yeah.
So the big boys like Extra Space, Publix, U-Haul, CubeSmart, they all have what they call third-party management. So we can hire them to run our facilities.
Oh.
But we just also opened up our own branding, One Stop Self-Storage. And so we launched that this week or past week in Dayton. And so we will be implementing that one in our new facilities going forward as One Stop Self-Storage.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's cool. What didn't I ask you about self-storage?
Well, I think the big difference is that, I would say that 50% of our investors are doing it for growth. Yep. And, within the different asset classes, if you're looking at a Class C, which is like a smaller mom and pop, we consider that like a penny stock. You're going to get a nice yield, but you're not going to see huge appreciation. A Class B facility would be more of like a suburban market, so outside the city of Toronto, so like Mississauga or, Cambridge where you are.
Yep.
And that might still be a drive up, but in Canada, you'd want it to be heated or not so much conditioned, but at least, if you're putting furniture in there, you want to make sure that it's not, freezing and expanding and contracting. So, having heating and cooling in there. Yep. And then, but that's like a blue chip stock. And then the other things that we do are the conversions or the new ones, which is Class A, where you can literally drive into the building. And so each of our more colder environments, you can literally pull into the building, the door comes down and you can open up your trunk, your van doors or whatever it is and totally unload it in a safe, dry and secure environment. And then, roll your stuff to the locker and then come back, drive out of the building. And we equate that to like a growth stock. And so they all have different objectives, but so I'd say 50% of our investors are looking within those criterias. And then the other 50% are looking for tax shelters. And it's an incredible tool that we've been able to utilize here in the United States between the opportunity zones. So we've done opportunity zones funding of these things. We've done historic tax credits. In fact, we just got $2.2 million of historic tax credits, which we're returning to our investors for our project in Wisconsin because we turned the building into a national park. And then the other one is cost segregation. So we can accelerate the depreciation of these things. And so they create great tax shelters as well. So it's just not a growth thing. It's a tax strategy as well. Interesting.
And then I'm guessing you raise the money through like a syndication sort of system to buy all these these multifamily, these units.
Well, that's become the latest buzzword, right? Syndication. So yeah. We've always called them equity investors.
Yeah.
And so, we do have a network of people that that have learned about us and grown to, either they knew us before and then they've gotten involved or they've learned of what we're doing and said, hey, can we join you? And so that's how we've always approached it.
Okay. No, I like it. It's a very interesting asset class because you don't have to deal with a lot of things that you're dealing with doing these multifamilies or single families. And the fewer moving parts, the simpler and more efficient you can run a lot of things. I mean, I'm interested in this class. It's very interesting. But anyway, I'm still going on a rant again. But Scott, I love this. I got a lot out of this, and I literally had one question written down when I started, and I filled a whole page. But because I'm like, oh, that just makes me think about this. That makes me think about this. But if people wanted to get a hold of you to be part of one of your projects or to learn more about it, where do they track you or your company down?
Well, our webpage is www.coda, CODA, for managementgroup.com. Okay. And they can email us at info@codamg.com. And Glenn, if someone references the show and they have a site that they think that might work, or they're interested in learning more about it and they reference the show, we'll certainly have a no obligation call with them and go through it. And I mean, this is a small world. We're not trying to steal properties or this or that from people. So if they want us to sign a non-disclosure, non-circumvent, we'd be more than happy to do that. But if they give us the address, we'll run, the demographics for them and just give them a sense, like, does it make sense to do self-storage in this location? And they don't have to, have any further conversations with us. It's just, does this site make sense? And we'll go through it and tell them why or why not. A pretty common, conversation that we have with people is like, I got a perfect site for self-storage. And I'm like, okay, well, where is it? And they're like, Austin, Texas. I'm like, okay. And well, have you done a feasibility or have you done demographics? Like, oh, no. Well, but there isn't any self-storage near us. And I said, well, just give me the address and, I'll do a double check for you. And sure enough, there's like 20 facilities within 2 miles. And I'm like, you might want to like pump the brakes a little bit on this one. And so yeah. Then we did the market feasibility. It came back at 13 square feet per capita. And I'm like, whatever you do not do self-storage here. This is like the worst place for you to do self-storage just because it's so saturated, and when it gets that way, then it takes longer to lease up, you get less revenue and, it just puts more pressure on your project. So we're happy to go through it and, people, send us pictures of buildings and we go through it and, we've been able to, assess things in terms of, does it make a good conversion? And so, or a new site. And we'd be happy to do that for your listeners.
That's interesting. Like, and then how would that work out? So would it be like, we're looking to partnership on it to convert it for them, and then, or are you looking to purchase the property and do it yourself? How does that usually play out? I'm just curious.
Well, it really has more to do with what the person who brings the property wants to do with it.
Okay.
We've done all three. We've done, like, we're building one in Florida right now that we're beginning on the design and the build of it, where it's an existing operator who said, like, I've never developed before, and they've hired us to do that. We are JVing the property that we're buying, the Class C. We're partnering with someone who came to us and said, we want to get into this asset class, and we want to do it with you. And then there's others which we just do on our own.
So we got your contact information. This is wonderful information. I might keep you on the phone for a second afterwards, because I have a building that is like right in some of the neighborhoods you just were talking about that could be a conversion. So maybe I'll just get you to look at it quick for 10 seconds and we'll move on. But thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time, Scott.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed it.